Good morning. The Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation will come to order. Today we're here to talk about stopping deadly drugs from crossing our maritime borders. But you cannot stop illegal drugs from crossing a border if you don't believe in having them. The Biden administration and former DHS Secretary Mayorkas deliberately ignored the painful connection between their open border policies and the devastation wrought by illegally trafficked drugs on families, communities, and our country. Trying to have a country without borders led to an influx of illegal aliens, drug smuggling, sex trafficking, and tragically, far too many American lives lost. That dereliction of basic sovereignty left the Coast Guard in an impossible position. The Coast Guard has admitted it missed opportunities to intercept drugs because it was overwhelmed chasing and catching illegal immigrants. Despite the Biden administration's lack of interest in border security, Republicans were able to make some progress. In the Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2022, I secured funding for a blimp-based radar system at South Padre Island to combat drug runners, poachers, and human traffickers. Today, it is still protecting South Texas. Similarly, my provision requiring data sharing between CBP and the Coast Guard is streamlining interdiction in the southern maritime border, halting illegal incursions into the United States. In contrast to Democrat ambivalence about the border crisis, President Trump and congressional Republicans are making real gains in border security through the Coast Guard. In the last month, the Coast Guard interdicted an historic amount of illegal drugs. Just last week, it offloaded 37,000 pounds of seized cocaine, worth $279 million. That's going to make a real difference in keeping communities safe from criminals and addiction. But protecting Americans from deadly illicit narcotics extends beyond our borders. We also need to reverse the Biden administration's dangerous policies in the Middle East, where maritime drug running bankrolls Iran's malign activities. Coast Guard cutters recently caught advanced weapons originating in Iran and bound for the Houthis in Yemen, as well as hundreds of kilograms of methamphetamines, heroin, and other illegal drugs from Dow in the Arabian Sea. The Coast Guard and other federal agencies have been catching and releasing Iranian drug runners, meaning there was no consequence beyond losing cargo for financing terrorism. Let me be clear. Catch and release is a disgrace and an insult to those who've lost their lives to Iranian terrorism. That's why I've included language in the Coast Guard Reauthorization Act of 2025 to empower the Coast Guard and the Navy to respond forcefully to Dow's running drugs and weapons when they've helped finance Iranian terror. Under President Trump's leadership, we need to pass the Coast Guard Reauthorization Act and end the catch and release approach to Middle East drug enforcement. That legislation, which has broad bipartisan and bicameral support, would also close a loophole in the ability to prosecute cartels for drug smuggling on remotely operated drone ships, like the one in the hearing room today. We also need to enact the Pay Our Coast Guard Act, which I will reintroduce this week along with Senator Cantwell, Sullivan, Baldwin, Wicker, and Blunt-Rochester, to ensure that the Coast Guard is no longer the only armed service that goes unpaid during a government shutdown. As I've said before, the Coast Guard deserves to be paid without question and without delay. Finally, today we will hear powerful testimony from the unthinkable damage caused by illicit drugs like fentanyl to American families. Texan Jena Ehlinger will testify about the effects this crisis had on her own family. I'm grateful she is here today as she works to turn tragedy into progress, and I look forward to hearing from Mrs. Ehlinger and the rest of our witnesses about what law enforcement needs to protect our communities. Another American lost to fentanyl is one too many. I know that Ranking Member Cantwell agrees with me on this point, and that's why we're working together on legislation to stop illicit fentanyl smuggling in the United States. I'm grateful for her partnership in this endeavor, and now turn to her for opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this very important hearing on fentanyl and what our committee and committee jurisdiction can do to stop the scourge of fentanyl. I very much appreciate the witnesses being here, Police Chief of Spokane, Chief Hall, and Mrs. Ehlinger. So sorry for your loss of your son, Jake. You are such a brave advocate, and thank you. There are many brave advocates like Laura Lynch, who talks in Seattle about the loss of her daughter, Brilliant, and you are making a difference, so thank you for being here today. And I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, as we fight this scourge and work within our committee jurisdiction. Of the 10 states with the highest number of drug-related overdoses, they all host major intermodal hubs. That is to say, states like mine, Washington, and yours, Texas, are clear nexuses to transportation networks. I think we're going to hear from Chief Hall about how those networks allow for the distribution of fentanyl once they are across the border. And overdose deaths continue to rise in most Western states, up 14% in Washington just last year. The supply chain is clear. The Chinese triad sells precursor chemicals to Mexican drug cartels hidden on ships and in air cargoes, and cartels make fentanyl and smuggle it through the United States. They hide fentanyl in personal vehicles, commercial trucks, buses, trains, planes, and even on unmanned aerial vehicles. So this is a danger to our national security and our transportation security. It is very highly toxic. So it is, Mr. Chairman, the jurisdiction of our committee to have oversight over transportation security. Last year, I fought for more non-intrusive inspection technologies at U.S. Customs and Border CBP, who I know we'll hear from as well, about how it now has 370 large non-intrusive inspection systems and more than 4,000 small systems across various ports of entry. I've seen firsthand how this helps us detect better the next generation of technology. Vapor technology could be developed by our Pacific Northwest Lab and the University of Washington to increase even the speed and accuracy of this analysis. Our national lab's Vapor ID accurately detects and identifies the vapors from illicit drugs and explosives in real time in extremely small amounts. Rather than using surface swipes or the pulse of air for analysis, the system sniffs the vapors much the way a trained canine can detect explosives. So our borders are not our only problem, but this fentanyl detection at our borders is working. We need to do more. Fentanyl smuggling happens every day within the borders of our country, on our interstates, on our Amtrak, at our bus terminals, at our airports, and concealed U.S. mail. And we must track the activities of these transportation networks. Recent interdiction efforts in the state of Washington illustrates the importance of joint law enforcement efforts at our transportation hubs and networks. Just last October, we had the largest coordinated drug trafficking bust in Seattle, 600 officers from 10 different states, local law enforcement agencies, and they disrupted a violent drug trafficking gang. It resulted from a wiretap investigation of a shipment of fentanyl into the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. A year-long investigation was led by Homeland Security, the Seattle Police, involving the U.S. Attorney, FBI, DEA, ATF, CBP, Washington State Patrol, the King County Sheriff's Office, and Bellevue, Everett, Renton Police Departments, and Yakima Narcotics and Gang Task Force members. And in January of 2023, law enforcement also conducted a bust at SeaTac, discovering more than 400,000 fentanyl pills in a checked baggage of drug couriers. Traffickers were smuggling millions of pills into Puget Sound. The Port of Seattle Police Department, working with DEA and K-9, seized that fentanyl, and the Phoenix Police Department then arrested the suspects in Arizona. In 2024, the Burien Police Department, King County Sheriff's Office, and DEA seized more than 1 million fentanyl pills and meth and heroin, and traffickers transported hundreds of pounds of drugs in a semi-truck on a regular trip from Southern California into Washington. So we must give law enforcement more tools to attack these transportation networks and stop the flow of these drugs into our states. Chief Kevin Hall of the Spokane Police Department with us today has worked closely with federal, state, and local law enforcement for more than 30 years. He'll be speaking to this experience in Eastern Washington and what he calls the superhighways for fentanyl distribution. As an enrolled member of the Colville tribe, he also knows that tribal communities have been hard hit by fentanyl crisis because it's another place to hide these drugs and these rings. And that is why last year I introduced with Senators Baldwin, Lujan, and Rosen the Stop Fentanyl Smuggling Act, largely supported by law enforcement, transportation, and forensic science groups, including the National High Intensity Drug Area. And so witness Shannon Kelly is a director of the National High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Program. She's also a member of the Interdiction Coordinator at the Office of the National Drug Control Policy, so I look forward to asking her about this and the ways in which we can all work together to stop the flow of fentanyl, accelerate the development of next-generation non-intrusive inspection technology, and build state and local forensic science capabilities. So I hope that we all can work together collaboratively. I think it shows that we can disrupt this trafficking. So I'm very pleased to work with you, Mr. Chairman, on these issues, and I appreciate your focus on the Coast Guard's critical role in this area. I know that the Coast Guard has been working, but we need to do more. I want to acknowledge that the crew of the Coast Guard, Washi, who interdicted more than 37,000 pounds of cocaine worth $275 million earlier this month. I'm also, though, saddened to hear that a crew member was lost at sea, so our thoughts and prayers are with their family and friends. I think Senator Cruz, you and I have introduced this bipartisan Coast Guard Reauthorization Act, which would increase authorization levels, and I hope that the Coast Guard's critical counter-narcotics mission and other missions will be bolstered in our efforts. We need to do everything, as you have displayed here, that if you leave a territory unaddressed, that is where the drug will flow. So attacking this at all levels is the right idea. And so look forward to working with you as we in this committee tackle the transportation networks that are threatening the lives of young individuals and many more Americans. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I'll now introduce the first panel. Joining us on the first panel today is Mrs. Jena Ehlinger, who was the mother of Jake Ehlinger of Texas. Mrs. Ehlinger is a mom who turned unimaginable grief, the nightmare of every parent, into action after losing her son Jake to fentanyl poisoning in 2021. Since then, she has fought tirelessly to raise awareness about the dangers of fentanyl, to advocate for stronger drug policies, and to work to ensure that no other family has to endure the same devastating loss. Our second witness is Mr. Kevin Hall, Chief of Police for the City of Spokane, and he's been on the front lines of the fight against the fentanyl crisis. Thank you, Chief, for your service. Thank you both for being here. Mrs. Ehlinger, you are recognized for 5 minutes, and I understand that you'll be starting your testimony with a brief video.
Jake was just a bundle of love and joy and happy from the day he was born. He loved sports, he loved being outdoors, he loved his friends, he had a very creative side. We all say he gave the best hugs, like in the entire world, just big old bear hugs. He played football at the University of Texas. Jake just had a fire about him, and it was a good way to release that fire. He was a finance major in the School of McCombs when he passed away. His anxiety was pretty high the last probably year of his life, and I think it was just the pressure of school and football. We were in Mexico at a friend's daughter's wedding when I got the news that Jake had died. I was just in complete, utter shock. I mean, it's like an out-of-body experience because you just are like, no, not my child. That can't be right. The problem is the medical examiners are coming in and they're finding someone dead. They know it's not suicide because it's obviously not suicide. And so the only other box they have to check is accidental overdose. and it's not an accidental overdose, it's poisoning. These young adults are buying these pills thinking they're getting one thing and they're getting something else. I wish I could tell you that we found the person that sold it to Jake, but we did not. Basically, the DEA and the police were like, sorry, there's nothing we can do. We can't help you. We were so confused, like how in the world are people getting away with this? And of course, my horror is if we don't do anything, more and more kids are going to be dying every day. And so what House Bill 6 does is anybody who is lacing drugs with fentanyl can now be charged and prosecuted, including for murder. The facts that I wish the average parent knew about the dangers of fentanyl is do not think it won't be your kid. I would have never in a million years dreamed that Jake would die of fentanyl poisoning. Like, this is happening every day to so many teenagers and young adults. So do not put your head in the sand and think there's no way this will happen in my family, because it could.
Good morning. My name is Jena Ehlinger. I never imagined that I would be on the front lines of a war I knew nothing about. And then I received the life-shattering call that my 20-year-old son Jake had been poisoned with fentanyl. This photo of Jake was taken 10 days before that call. Jake grew up in Austin, Texas. He was a gifted athlete who also excelled in academics. With a score of 35 out of 36 on the ACT exam, combined with his stellar high school grades and athleticism, Jake was recruited to play linebacker by a number of top-tier universities, including Stanford, Yale, Brown, Penn, and Dartmouth. Jake passed on those incredible offers so that he could play football at his dream school, the University of Texas. His dad and I went to UT, and his brother Sam was then UT's quarterback. Jake wanted to play football with his brother on the team he had been an avid fan of his entire life. Jake was admitted into the Macomb School of Business as a finance major, became a member of the Texas Silver Spurs, and was a UT football player and a straight-A student. In the spring of 2021, as a sophomore, he was looking forward to his upcoming summer internship at Dell, and his little sister Morgan joining him at UT in the fall. On May 6, 2021, I received that horrific call. Jake had taken a counterfeit Xanax that had been laced with fentanyl. As with many things, until you've lived it, the reality of such devastation is difficult to fully understand. To our family's further devastation, when the death certificate was issued, the DEA and the Austin police informed us that they were closing their investigation because the manner of death on the death certificate was classified as an accident. Jake's death was not an accident. He was killed, literally poisoned to death. Labeling the poisoning and murder of my son as an accident resulted in the premature closing of federal and local law enforcement investigations, ensured that no one will ever be arrested for poisoning and killing Jake, prevented the case from ever reaching prosecutor's desk. I hope no other families have to live through the additional nightmare that their child's killer will never be arrested or prosecuted because a medical examiner labeled their child's poisoning as accident for statistical purposes. Through my experience, I learned that there were few to no consequences for murdering someone by poisoning them with a fentanyl-laced pill. Most laws address larger quantities of drugs, not the mere 2 milligrams of fentanyl that is considered a lethal dose. As a result, those illegally manufacturing and distributing fentanyl remained on the streets and continued killing our children, one pill at a time, with little fear of prosecution. Thankfully, with the help of friends, we were able to pass a law in Texas addressing this vacuum in the law. Our legislation requires medical examiners to classify death from a fentanyl-laced substance as what it is, poisoning, and created a murder offense for the unlawful manufacture or distribution of fentanyl resulting in death, including from just one pill. Now in the state of Texas, on the death certificate, it is described as fentanyl poisoning, thereby keeping law enforcement investigations from prematurely closing, and illegally manufacturing or distributing a fentanyl-laced substance that results in death, even from one pill, may be prosecuted as murder. And those poisoning Texans can no longer kill one pill at a time without fear of arrest and prosecution and are being taken off the streets. And other families may not have to live with the fact that no one will ever be prosecuted for killing their child or their loved one. The law has been effective. Before this law, there were no Texas state murder charges for deaths from one fentanyl-laced pill. In the first 8 months, there were approximately 25 murder charges. To date, there have been nearly 60 murder charges. But we're just one state. We need federal laws to accomplish these goals and more nationwide, including stopping the distribution of fentanyl in our country. Senators, our country is at war and we're losing the war, as evidenced by fentanyl becoming the #1 killer in the United States for ages 18 to 45. It impacts all races, religions, socioeconomic statuses, and political affiliations. This lethal epidemic is killing young Americans and destroying families. I'm just one mom who lost her precious son. You are among the most powerful people in this country, and there is no higher use of that power than to save someone's child and perhaps even your own. Thank you for listening. God bless you all.
Thank you, Mrs. Ehlinger. Thank you for the difference you're making in our home state of Texas, and thank you for speaking to the American people today, and I hope that Congress hears your words today.
Thank you.
Chief Hall.
Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Cantwell, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the fentanyl crisis, an issue of national urgency that devastates communities across the country, including my own in Spokane, Washington. My name is Kevin Hall. I'm honored to serve as police chief for the city of Spokane, the second largest city in the state of Washington. I was appointed to the position in August of 2024 after previously serving more than 32 years in the Tucson Police Department in Tucson, Arizona, the last nearly 8 years as assistant chief. My 33-year career in policing has focused on violent crime, addressing the impacts of drugs and drug trafficking, and public safety at both local and national levels. Since 2019, the annual number of opioid drug overdoses has doubled in Washington state, and Spokane's opioid deaths have surpassed the state's average. Recent reports by the CDC and DEA illustrating national declines in fatal drug overdoses are not the reality in Washington state. The Spokane Fire Department's calls for overdoses have increased 30% in 2024 over the previous year. Like every other urban police agency in the country, the Spokane Police Department continues to allocate more and more resources to address open-air drug use, fatal drug overdoses, and the overall harm caused to the community by fentanyl. The Spokane County Medical Examiner reported at least 346 opioid-related deaths last year, over 75% involving fentanyl. The economic toll is staggering. The Senate's Joint Economic Committee estimated the opioid crisis cost the U.S. $1.5 trillion in 2020 alone. Fentanyl's impact stems from its potency, 40 to 50 times more lethal than heroin, and its alarming accessibility. From my experience in southern Arizona, I know that most fentanyl enters the U.S. through legal ports of entry, concealed in commercial cargo trucks, passenger vehicles, trailers, and RVs. Recent seizures highlight the scale of trafficking along transportation routes. In Tucson, law enforcement intercepted 1.7 million fentanyl pills in just 2 stops in late 2024. Spokane's supply chain follows similar patterns, moving drugs from Mexico along interstates I-19, I-10, and I-5 before reaching eastern Washington via I-90. Spokane officers have recently encountered bulk powder fentanyl, an emerging and highly dangerous trend. Fentanyl trafficking has direct and violent consequences. A harrowing example of this occurred in Spokane when an investigation where traffickers using I-90 transported bulk fentanyl pill loads to Spokane from the Tri-Cities area. Spokane PD and federal partners, after an intensive investigation, interdicted the trafficker, resulting in a violent midday shootout with Spokane police officers that endangered innocents, including small children who were in the area. 2,000 fentanyl pills were seized from the car that the suspect was traveling in. Elsewhere in Washington, drug traffickers have used commercial trucks, passenger rail, and even commercial airlines, as seen in a 2023 investigation at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, where 400,000 fentanyl pills were found in checked baggage. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security estimated that drug traffickers were bringing millions of pills a month into the Seattle region via drug couriers' checked luggage. Another separate investigation in Seattle in the fall of 2024 culminated in the arrest of 12 violent fentanyl traffickers, the seizure of significant amounts of fentanyl, dozens of weapons, and highlighted what effective federal and local law enforcement partnerships look like. With the Department of Homeland Security, Seattle Police Department, U.S. Attorney General's Office among the agencies involved. This investigation directly stemmed from the previously mentioned checked baggage investigation at SeaTac Airport. Interdicting fentanyl requires strong partnerships between local, state, federal, and tribal agencies. We must enhance these collaborations with improved technology and resources. That is why I respectfully urge Congress to pass the Stop Smuggling Illicit Synthetic Drugs on U.S. Transportation Networks Act. This legislation would expand non-intrusive inspection technologies such as drive-through and mobile X-ray sensors, specialized canine resources, vapor technology, to strengthen our ability to detect and disrupt fentanyl trafficking before it reaches our streets. The fight against fentanyl is urgent, it's real. Strengthening our enforcement capabilities will save lives. Thank you for your time, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Chief. Mrs. Ehlinger, I'm going to start with you. Thank you for coming and telling us about your son, Jake. As a father, my heart breaks for you. You have gone through a nightmare that every parent, every grandparent is terrified of experiencing. You've done an enormous amount in Texas to help prevent more tragic deaths. What advice can you give to parents who might want to make a difference preventing future fentanyl poisonings?
The first thing I would say is that talk to your kids about drugs. Use the word fentanyl. Don't be afraid to talk about it. Share statistics. Explain how dangerous it is compared to when we were growing up. And also, I would say for kids that might have a lot of pressure on them. Kids in our society have a higher rate of anxiety than ever before. And to take the stigma away of it's okay if you need help. Like if you feel like you need some counseling or whatever that is, that it's okay to ask for some help and do not turn to a counterfeit, drug to try to make you feel better.
An illustration that a DEA agent told me in Texas of just the potency of fentanyl is he took a sweet and low packet, said tear it open and empty the contents out so that there's nothing in it. And then he said stick your finger inside the packet and remove your finger and you have a couple of little tiny specks of sweet and low.
Exactly.
That's enough fentanyl to kill you. I can tell you I've done that with our girls and tried to convey the point, but you're terrified that a teenager, a young adult at one party, somebody gives them some stupid pill and that's their last moment on earth. Through your hard work, the Texas Penal Code now criminalizes the delivery or manufacture of fentanyl that results in death. And the code requires medical examiners to properly classify fentanyl poisoning deaths. As you noted, over 60 drug peddlers have already been charged in Texas with murder since the law went into effect. Have you spoken with others in Texas about what these changes have meant to them when the tragedy of fentanyl poisoning occurs, and what have they told you?
Yes, unfortunately, I've made a lot of new friends because of this tragedy. Pain is a really strong motivator. And anytime there is a fentanyl death, whatever the 7 degrees of separation, somebody will ask me, can you talk to this person? They just lost their child to fentanyl. And I'm like, absolutely. Send me their phone number. And I can literally pull up my phone and just type in fentanyl, and 30 names of people I never knew before come up in my phone. They're extremely thankful. It's a very motivated group of people, as you can imagine. Parents that have lost their children, probably one of the most motivated group of people. And there's also, just in Austin alone, there's a group called Angel Moms, and there's probably 60 of these mothers who have lost their children to fentanyl, and that's in Austin, Texas only.
Wow. In the video you played, you said that you were unable to determine who sold the drugs to your son, Jake. In the last Congress, I passed legislation called the Trank Act to help improve the technology for detecting and identifying fentanyl and other related drugs. And Senator Cantwell and I are now working on new legislation in this space. How important is it for families to have the technology in place to track the origins and pathways that these drugs travel into the country?
I think it's extremely important. I mean, yes, shockingly, the DEA could not open Jake's phone to retrieve any information to find anyone responsible. My understanding is that these young adults are buying these counterfeit pills, thinking they're getting one thing and getting killed, through social media platforms like Snapchat and things like that. So I know that's how they're coming through. And then I also know that they are also being delivered through rideshare apps. So there is definitely a problem between all of the different social media and technology applications that these young adults use and have their hands on, not understanding the dangers of them.
Yeah. The record illegal immigration flows during the Biden administration have clearly taken a toll on the Coast Guard's counter-drug mission. And so I'm going to submit to the hearing record a DHS Office of Inspector General report entitled "The Coast Guard Faces Challenges Interdicting Non-Commercial Vessels Smuggling Drugs into the United States." This report notes that the Coast Guard did not meet its cocaine interdiction goals because it did not have enough cutters available to perform the counter-drug mission. Those cutters had been diverted to interdict illegal immigrants. The DHS OIG estimated that the Coast Guard could have interdicted up to an additional 89 metric tons of cocaine had those cutters been performing the counter-drug mission, and without objection, so ordered, entered into the record. And with that, I recognize Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for mentioning the Trank Act. I too supported that important legislation, which is one of the tools. And I just want to say, Ms. Ehlinger, again, you know, we've had, I think, 11 regional meetings in my state, and it's just, the story is the same. The story is the same. And the call is the same. We need more to alert. I'll never forget a high school student in Yakima, Washington, telling me that, you know, having an assembly once a year is not enough. You should be telling high schoolers every day, do not take anything given to you by anyone other than a healthcare provider. Just don't. And I think that we have to amplify on many different fronts. We have to fight this scourge on many different fronts. So again, thank you for your willingness to continue to push on this. And you know, the jurisdiction of this committee is a little more on the transportation network, but your illumination of the problem just shows you what distribution does to destroy families. I want to ask Chief Hall about those distribution networks, because we hear a lot about the border and we want more security and detection at the border, but it's clear that these rings are so elaborate that by attacking the transportation network, we can discover and illuminate and catch these rings. And what have we learned about these networks and transportation system, and why is interdiction, like you've experienced in Spokane or Tucson, why do we need to expand the tools given to law enforcement to help with this?
Thank you, Ranking Member Cantwell, for the question. There are a number of different reasons on why we need to do this, but primarily when I talk to my DEA, DHS partners, it's that we're catching a fraction of the illegal narcotics that are entering the country. Such a small amount. It looks huge on the newspaper, on the front page when we post shots of it for the media, but that's just a fraction of what's actually entering the country, and we're missing so much more, and we know we're missing so much more. The investigations, particularly the collaborative investigations with our federal partners, are where we're the most functional and we see the most success. Bringing local, state, tribal, and federal partners together just enhances or scales up all of the skill sets and brings in quite frankly, the resources of the federal government that most of us don't have. But collaborating allows us to locate more, to utilize the intelligence base from the federal government on international or national transportation routes, and through, like we said, rail, sea, air, and the interstates, which is where we're seeing most of this. The investment by the cartels, and make no mistake, this is all cartel-driven, is such that they will completely disassemble a vehicle, a brand-new vehicle, put as much narcotics into every single void inside that vehicle and then assemble it again. They will go through that amount of energy, put the vehicle back together and put it on the road, and it's off on the freeways. The 1.7 million pills that I referenced in my opening statement, that was in 2 vehicles, 2 sedans, 2 nondescript sedans. That had to be completely disassembled in order to recover all of those narcotics.
And how did you discover to check those?
Investigations.
Something told you.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. This is why I want us to have a more collaborative effort here, because when you look at the technology that we have at the border that is doing some of this detection, but like you said, they're tearing cars apart. And so what do you think a new vapor technology could help us do?
Any tool will help us down this road, whether it's X-ray technology, vapor technology, even going to, like I call old school canine technology. They're all very effective in different ways, and having a layered approach and a cross-sector approach, multifaceted. This is a very complex problem. It requires complex solutions, and having all of those technologies and all of those different approaches is just going to enhance law enforcement's ability to detect and seize these narcotics.
Well, I'm just going to be a little more clear about the challenges of getting a warrant on search and seizure are complex. But when you're at one of our ports or transportation systems and you have a you can basically non-invasive way to detect the movement of fentanyl. That's what I want at every transportation hub, and because that will stop this flow. And I mean, it's not going to stop all of it, but it will give us the tools that you're talking about. And then how can we best help too on the labs and the information? What's the gap there that we're seeing?
I'm sorry, the labs?
Locally, how you have to do the work to try to detect and figure out what you've acquired.
A lot of it is just the sheer number, the backlog. So say we're working with the state lab in order to process the narcotics that we seize, and we have to wait for that processing in order to charge for the most part. So it's that kind of resource that is limited. And I know from my time in Arizona, it was the same issue there. It's just it's a capacity issue. There's so much illegal narcotics coming into the country and so few people doing this work, including lab personnel, law enforcement, even harm reduction agencies that we work with. Going to an earlier point is we inform them everything that you see out on the street, from marijuana to what you think is cocaine to what you think is a prescribed pill, is going to have fentanyl in it. What we're finding out is everything we test has fentanyl in it. So we just tell everybody, know what you're taking, it's fentanyl.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell. There's roughly 1,000 miles between my home in North Carolina and the southern border, but on average, 9 North Carolinians lose their lives every day due to fentanyl. I just want to thank you personally, both for being here. When I talk to law enforcement officers in all 100 counties in North Carolina, I repeatedly hear that every single county in North Carolina is a border county, largely because of the prior administration's policies, but I think that we are on track to do much better. The county next to where I live, the sheriff there, he said, We just had a traffic stop. It looked like some of the pictures that were shown earlier. And there was enough in that trunk to kill 250,000 people. Unbelievable. The Chief, while you're here, is there anything else Congress can do to give local law enforcement the additional tools to go after drug and human traffickers?
Resources are always scarce, always scarce. You know, I know currently the Department of Justice is holding up grants. I know that they'll come out sooner or later, but those types of grant funding helps us at the local level, helps us at the state level, and it helps our collaborations with HITDAs and different task forces that we have created with the DEA, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security Investigations, all those different agencies. We are all facing the same scarcity of resources.
Thank you. Ms. Ehlinger, thank you for sharing your story, Jake, as well. I would imagine that our children are about the same age. And we don't sit up here, whether it's in this body or across the hall or in the House of Representatives, as theorists. We're all personally affected by this, so it means a lot. I remember when I first ran in 2016, and right before the election, I was given the devastating news that the young volunteer staffer that was driving me that day had just lost his younger brother, about the same age as Jake, and it was from something he thought was just something innocent, but it wasn't. And that brother that survived and was volunteering for me that day gave a speech 2 weeks ago regarding fentanyl, except it wasn't at on that side of the dais, it was on this side, because he is now a member of Congress in the U.S. House of Representatives, and he's in the fight in the other chamber. So again, we're not theorists, we're all personally affected by this. And again, I thank you both for what you do.
Thank you.
Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Mrs. Ehlinger. Thank you so much for being here to bravely share your story about your family and your son. And I thank you for your tireless work to bring attention to this tragedy. I believe to my core that your efforts are saving lives. And I'm heartbroken for your family's tremendous loss. I've heard from and sat with mothers in Wisconsin who have shared with me stories just like yours. Fentanyl is devastating families and communities in my state, and we know throughout our country. And I'm committed to fighting this deadly epidemic on all fronts. And I know my colleagues, as you've already heard, are hearing similar demands from their constituents. Congress has taken a few important bipartisan steps in the right direction, but clearly there is so much more work for us to do. So, Mrs. Ehlinger, it is thanks to the brave advocacy of people like you that this important issue remains really forefront in our work, and I thank you for that. Chief Hall, I want to thank you for your work, both in Tucson and now Spokane, in the front lines to protect Americans. And we have to make sure that we're putting every resource possible towards protecting Americans and stopping the movement of deadly fentanyl and illicit substances across our borders, but also throughout our communities. For that reason, I worked with Senator Cantwell to introduce a bill that would stop smuggling of drugs through our domestic transportation networks. We've already heard that bill elevated during this hearing, and I am eager to collaborate with both Senator Cantwell and Senator Cruz, again, this Congress, to continue that work. I'd love to hear your recommendations, Chief Hall, about actions the federal government can take to improve the coordination between local law enforcement and other levels of law enforcement, but also additional resources that would help you and your colleagues detect and seize the illegal drugs right on our own streets. Like my colleagues, I've held many first responder roundtables, throughout the state of Wisconsin. And sometimes there are challenges in the various levels that are looking at these distribution networks, these domestic cartels, if you will, and tracking high-level cases versus the work you're doing to find the individual perpetrator in a particular case. Can you please share a little bit more about that?
Sure. Thank you, Senator Baldwin. I appreciate the question. And I'll try not to get myself in trouble here.
It's a tough question.
There are so many different things the federal government can do and have done in the past, quite frankly. We have always had a good partnership with our federal law enforcement partners. But I think sometimes I would submit one of the first things we could do is draw back a little and look at a wider perspective of what we're dealing with here and define it is transportation networks, and disrupting those networks in any way, shape, or form will disrupt the marketplace, the business model that these cartels operate under. And in that same fashion, I think we can spend a little bit more time providing the training and resources for state and local, and quite frankly, even federal law enforcement to look at how they are funneling money. This is a for-profit business in this model, and it's not giant loads of cash anymore. It's Bitcoin, and it's electronic wallets, and local and state and a lot of federal agencies don't have the sophistication to track that money and seize that money, and quite frankly, in a lot of cases, it's completely untrackable. But those, while we're just now starting to dip our toe in how to go after those funds, those illegal funds gained through, quite frankly, the killing of our children, that would be enormously helpful if we took a look at that, as well as the transportation networks. And as I said before, this is a very complex problem. It's gonna need a very complex solution that crosses sectors and is multidimensional, and that's one of the ways I can think of. We just had this discussion back where I'm from, is how do we go after those wallets and those Bitcoins that are being utilized to hide these illegal funds from the government.
Thank you, Chief Hall.
So first of all, Ms. Ehlinger, thank you for being here. My youngest son is 26, which would be about, if I would guess, Jake's age today. I can't imagine, honestly, how you've been able to do that, so God bless you. God bless you for your strength. Because quite frankly, there's probably a part of you that's just really pissed off. And so pushing that and suppressing that down has got to be really hard. And I'm really pissed off too, because I've seen the federal government do so little to attack this. I mean, you said something in your testimony that really stuck with me, which is we're at war and we're losing that war. Would you agree? You feel that way?
100%, and I am so thankful for this administration and for being here today, because it's, as you said, it's so painful just to live with not having Jake every day, and then to just know that our amazing country is just, it felt like to me, was doing absolutely nothing, and more and more and more and more children were dying every single day, and it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, in Ohio, we probably lose about 4,000 people a month to fentanyl poisoning. And you look back and you go, okay, like, if we're losing 4,000 American kids every year just in Ohio, 110,000 around the country, you would think that would be like a 12-alarm fire in Washington, D.C. over the last 4 years. Yet, what did we do?
Exactly.
We didn't do anything at the border, like nothing. In fact, sat here on their hands while they knew this was going on. And so I get the sentiment today from the other side, but honestly, to me, it falls so short. Number one, what did President Trump do? Declared the Mexican cartels foreign terrorist organizations. We should wipe those animals off the face of the earth. And yet the administration in the last 4 years did nothing about that. We should make anybody who distributes fentanyl, an accessory to first-degree murder. And if you're the ultimate supplier of that, then you are a first-degree murder federal charge recipient. Anybody who is involved in the banking of that, in the transportation of that, if you're a tech company and you're allowing the sale of these products, then you, the executives of these companies, are an accessory to first-degree murder. We can't have half measures. If it was my son, I wouldn't be able to sit through this, honestly. How you do it, like I said, I'll repeat it again. God bless you for doing what you're doing. And to my Democrat colleagues, I hope this isn't just words about more government spending, but rather actual attacks on what we're seeing at our southern border, that we treat this as an existential threat to our country. You said, Chief, turn to you. You said this is a for-profit business. This isn't just a for-profit business. This is a multi-billion-dollar-a-year operation that this country is enabling. This country and this administration and the majority that had control of Congress over the last 4 years, they made these drug cartel members so insanely wealthy. Those are the billionaires that they should be talking about when they rant on a Senate floor that they're going after. And Chief, you said something, God bless you too, for the work that you do and all law enforcement does. But I just push back a little bit on something you said. You said that most fentanyl comes across legal ports of entry. We don't know that. We have absolutely no idea how much fentanyl comes across through non-designated ports of entry, because by definition, we have no idea. When I've been on the border, you look at what the Border Patrol agents are doing, where you have the surge of human trafficking on one side, these fake asylum claims, that my colleagues won't even vote on a bill to say, hey, you can't claim asylum through a non-designated port of entry. They won't even agree to that, to say, hey, if you're going to claim asylum, you got to do it at a legal port of entry and you got to wait. No, they want to parole these people into the country, which is insane. So the Border Patrol agents have to go to those non-designated port of entry. I was in Del Rio when the Haitian surge happened. There were ports of entries that were wide open. These were streets that were available. So we have no idea what comes across there. And we have to go right at the root cause and make the punishment so severe. So I'm all for investing more money in the Coast Guard. We have a big lake in Ohio. But I hope that what comes out of this testimony from both of you, and hopefully there's colleagues on the other side of the aisle that have kids that are your kids' age and realize what's really going on, and that we take this moment to say we are not going to allow a 9/11 plane to crash every single day in America, and do something about it. Pass legislation to make this happen. So I urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, you abdicated your duties for the last 4 years. Step up and work with us to pass meaningful legislation to attack the billionaires that you enabled on the other side of our border to kill our kids. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Moreno. Senator Sullivan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the witnesses very much. Mrs. Ehlinger, I want to extend my condolences too. Just read your testimony. Sounds like Jake was an incredible, amazing, gifted young man. I'm very sorry, really sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
Is that his UT uniform on right there?
Yes, sir.
My mom went to UT, so
Awesome.
I've been a Longhorns fan for a long time. But, let me ask a question. We have maybe you've met her. If you haven't, it would be really great because you're very similar to her. We have a very courageous woman in Alaska named Sandy Snodgrass. She's kind of had the same experience that you have. Her son Bruce was killed by a fentanyl overdose, like Jake. It was laced with something, and so she's done what you've done, which is kind of taken this horrible grief and that most people can't even imagine, and used it in a way to push for public policy changes in state law. She's done that in Alaska. And then she and I and our governor, we've teamed up on this big campaign we launched about 8 or 9 months ago in Alaska called One Pill Can Kill. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but what we're trying to do on that is to get to prevention, to let the young people in Alaska know that, hey, if you're taking a pill or smoking a joint, you might have no idea that this is laced with fentanyl. Believe it or not, my state in the last 2 years has had the highest overdose rates of fentanyl of any state in the country, Alaska, 4,000 miles from the border. So when people say, oh, what do you guys care up in Alaska? You're far away from the southern border. We care because it's killing our kids just like it's killing kids in Texas. So are you familiar with the One Pill Can Kill campaign, and have you guys done it in Texas? And I'd really like to get your sense of prevention. We're trying to we put this big campaign together, we've gotten all the high school kids and even junior high kids involved to do PSA announcements so they can learn from each other. I think it's most effective when it comes from peer to peer, not senators and governors telling them. So what's your sense on that? And I really appreciate your courage for being here. I know probably every single day you're missing your really wonderful son.
Yes, thank you so much. We actually, Governor Abbott in the state of Texas had a One Pill Kills campaign.
Oh, good.
And if you drive in the state of Texas on any highway, you will see signs that say One Pill Kills. And many people have also put up billboards with their children's pictures on them.
Wow.
Saying fentanyl kills. I think all of those things help. I 100% agree with you that coming from the younger generation is more impactful.
Yeah.
Part of the frustration for me has been, has anybody thinking about the fact that this is our future? These young people that are dying, that are getting wiped out in large numbers, that's the future of our country. So what is going to happen in 10 years when we have this horrific gap?
Yeah.
Because we've lost so many of them. My son is in the NFL, and they do the Cause for Cleats.
Yeah.
Cleats for a Cause, I'm sorry. And he, and then one of his friends also, who he played with at UT, wore their One Pill Kills fentanyl awareness cleats and got a great response from that. I think, like Senator Cantwell said earlier, we have to come at this from every angle.
Yeah.
It can't be, here, let's just go here and let's look at this. It is like we were saying, it's a war.
It is a war.
And we're losing. We're losing bad.
Well, if you have ideas from what you learned in Texas on the One Pill Can Kill campaign, prevention, right? So young people are aware. A lot of young people are not aware at all that this is taking a pill like that that's not a prescribed pill that they got from a pharmacist can be a Russian roulette death sentence.
It's exactly what I call it, is Russian roulette. I mean, it's in cocaine, it's in pot, it's in all of the things that in our generation people could experiment with, and they had no fear of dying. They just were making a really stupid mistake.
Yeah.
And a bad choice.
Well, look, we might look at kind of nationalizing some of these ideas of prevention. Real quick, so thank you again. Chief, I just had a quick question, too, for you. You served up in kind of the Pacific Northwest area and then down along the border. Any major differences? And then this is probably for the next panel, but what always really frustrates me on this is that Xi Jinping is a dictator, right? I mean, nobody does anything in China without his permission. And the flow that continues from China, he did a deal with President Trump. He did a deal with President Biden to stop this flow. And, it's more what we call promise fatigue with the Chinese. They make big announcements and they never keep their promises, even to our leaders. So what's your sense on kind of differences at the Pacific Northwest level that you've seen? That's Alaska, of course. And then any sense on the Chinese just ignoring it and wanting to kill young Americans?
I'll take the difference between Arizona and Washington first. The biggest difference I see is we would interdict massive loads in Tucson, Arizona. Tucson is 60 miles north of the international port of entry. And it was nonstop, and it was not unusual to get hundreds of thousands of pills or bulk powder form in the pounds in Arizona. That's much less likely up in Washington. It does happen, as we've seen, and as I've testified, it does happen, but not nearly as often. And that's because when it comes from the border, then it gets distributed throughout the nation. So we're getting smaller amounts up there, but the smaller amounts are just as deadly, and we have just as many fatal overdoses, and we have just as many social problems that come from fentanyl as every other city. So when I look at downtown Tucson and I look at downtown Spokane, if I didn't know where I was at, they would look very similar. And that's the impact that fentanyl has.
Great. And maybe for the record, I know I'm out of time, if you could answer the China question. I know it's a tough question, but I just think they're flooding the zone on purpose.
Respectfully, Senator, I'm going to stay out of the geopolitics. I know the precursor chemicals, for the most part, are coming from China, and how we stop those, I'm not sure, because they're not coming to the United States, they're going to Mexico. Yeah. So that would be the realm of you fine folks.
Thank you, Chief.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Sheehy, you're recognized.
Thank you for coming today, Jena. Thank you for taking on this cause. I know you've survived a terrible tragedy in your family, so thank you for turning that into productive advocacy, because it's going to take a whole country to come together to fix this. Chief, question for you. I'm Montana, so not too far from you. Spent a lot of time up in your neck of the woods fighting wildfires, so familiar with Spokane and the surrounding area. What is your feeling on the northern border as far as impacting your communities with regard to fentanyl and drug trafficking?
As far as the northern border, what we're seeing is very little coming south from Canada. Almost everything we've seen that we've been able to track, once again with our federal partners, it's all coming up from Mexico along the interstates, like I said, I-19 to I-5, or I-10 to I-5, and then I-90 into Spokane and northern Idaho. We are the urban hub of eastern Washington, and it all spreads out from there.
Yeah, we see the same in Montana, coming up I-15 to Butte and then over. So, what interface are you seeing at all with the tribal communities in the Pinwar region as far as how they're being impacted by the fentanyl crisis?
In the tribal communities, it's a little bit more of an invisible epidemic because, quite frankly, the tribe, for historical reasons, are far more isolated and have far less trust in the government. And so it's harder to get inroads into the tribes. And I'm speaking from my personal experience as a tribal member. I don't enforce the law on the tribes. I have no jurisdiction. But it is probably far more tragic because it's far more isolated, and it is not as well known on the tribes just because of that.
And what do you feel the way ahead is there? Obviously, we feel those same issues in Montana. We have reservation land and tribal communities all across the state, and they're dealing, with this crisis first and foremost. And the first thing I hear from our tribal leaders is the fentanyl crisis is tearing apart their communities. And, they fall into, as you well know, a very unique law enforcement construct with their sovereignty, but they still want their streets cleaned up. They still want their kids to be healthy. So given your experience in the region, what do you think are some ways ahead where we can start to thread that needle, where we can still respect the sovereignty of our tribal communities, but help them battle this epidemic and win?
I think much stronger and closer relationships with tribal authorities, local and state and federal authorities. I think we're getting there, at least in my region, in the Spokane region, with the Spokane tribe, Kalispell, Colville, all of those tribes. We're getting to a point where our relationships are getting stronger, where we understand this is a common issue that's killing all of us. It doesn't matter if you're Native or Indigenous, if you're from Spokane or if you're from OMAC. It's still going to kill you. And so we all need to come together. And I'm starting to see that collaboration and that cooperation amongst the tribal folks, the state, local, and federal as well.
Great. Thank you for making the trip out. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Sheehy. Senator Murkey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to begin just by expressing my deepest condolences to you, Mrs. Ehlinger, for your great loss, tragic loss. I'm just so sorry. we want to do everything we can in order to, in the future, do a better job. Because you're right, we are in a war against fentanyl, and that means we need every resource possible. We need to be tracking every overdose death. We need everyone to have access to naloxone, to reverse overdoses. We need enough providers and access to medications like methadone and Suboxone for people struggling with addiction. We need communities and law enforcement to have funding to prevent fentanyl from coming into their communities and respond once it's there. President Trump and I had lunch in September of 2017 as he was heading for a trip to China. I was the ranking member on that committee on foreign relations. And I talked to him about how important it was to tell President Xi to just stop those precursor chemicals from coming from China, because we were losing 80 to 100,000 people a year. And I also recommended to him that we work together on a bill to have detection devices along the southern border, and that there were actually devices in place that could detect that fentanyl from coming across the border. And in February of 2018, I stood with him, and he gave me the pen as he signed the bill to provide those tens of millions of dollars for the devices along the border to detect fentanyl. So I know it's just such a very important issue that we have to deal with. So Chief Hall, does your police department have to balance both stopping fentanyl smuggling and responding to the overdoses from fentanyl? How do you handle that?
It is a balance, Senator, and thank you for the question. Once again, it's how we prioritize the workload, and as you know, we're understaffed. Washington State is severely understaffed. I think it's number 50 out of the 50 states on a ratio of officers to population. So we struggle with that and allocating the appropriate amount of resources to addressing this issue. However, it is an issue of life or death, so we take that on seriously.
So how important is it for you, Chief, for Spokane to continue to receive sustained and reliable funding for all of the work that you're doing to take on the fentanyl crisis?
It's incredibly important. It's incredibly important. Funding is what we live on. That's how we pay my officers. That's how we pay for the technology that we use. It's how we pay for the programs that we use, some of which that you just mentioned, including naloxone, the administration of buprenorphine, and our work in the harm reduction area, trying to keep people alive.
And I am just so concerned that this Trump administration is too busy making drastic, unfocused cuts and engaging in political stunts rather than actually focusing its energy and addressing the fentanyl crisis, because the reality is that cuts to federal research will slow down finding better ways to test for fentanyl, to improve upon that. And as you know, a border wall is not going to stop all of it, no matter what. You're still going to need these additional resources that you have in the community, because it's going to come through legal ports of entry still, to some degree, no matter what happens. And disrupting funding to organizations dedicated to responding to the overdose crisis will just slow down the life-saving efforts that you engage in every single day. When we're talking about overdose and fentanyl epidemic, playing politics is just not going to solve the problem. You need the resources to do it. So, and that's why I worked with President Trump to have my Interdict Act be signed. That was a pragmatic, bipartisan. I did it with Senator Rubio in order to put that in place. But we need more equipment. We need more high-tech equipment, even at the local level. We just need more resources in your hands, which is why I introduced the Stop Fentanyl Overdoses Act to enhance information sharing between healthcare providers and law enforcement and to educate communities. So I thank you, Chief. I thank you, Mrs. Ehlinger. You've come here with serious efforts that you are recommending to us, and you deserve a serious response. And that's what I'm committed to having Congress provide for you, not just chainsaw solutions to problems. We have to focus in on where your needs are the greatest. I thank you.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Appreciate that. I want to thank you both for being here. This has been very important, very insightful, very helpful. And whether it's law enforcement or personal experience, it matters a lot to us. We want to conclude this panel, and we want to welcome our next panel, if they would please come forward to the witness table now. Thank you both so much.
I might have to keep talking to you about it, but it's okay for now. Thank you very much.
Our second panel of witnesses today include Ms. Shannon Kelly, Assistant Director, Office of National Drug Control Policy, U.S. Interdiction Coordinator and Director, National High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Program. Ms. Kelly has more than 2 decades of counter-drug experience and worked previously for the U.S. Department of Justice and the National Drug Intelligence Center. Thank you for being here. Rear Admiral Adam Chamie, U.S. Coast Guard Assistant Commandant for Response Policy. In this capacity, he is responsible for developing strategic response doctrine and policy guidance for all Coast Guard forces, including covering law enforcement activities and border maritime security. And lastly, Mr. Jonathan Miller, Executive Assistant Commissioner, Air and Marine Operations with U.S. Customs and Border Protection. His mission is to safeguard our nation by anticipating and confronting security threats through aviation and maritime law enforcement. Ms. Kelly, you're recognized for your opening statement.
Good afternoon. First, I want to thank Mrs. Ehlinger for sharing Jake's story with us. She's an eloquent and courageous spokesperson for the many Americans suffering from the illicit fentanyl crisis. Senator Budd and distinguished members of the committee, I'm honored to speak with you today about the challenges and opportunities facing our law enforcement partners as they combat illicit drug trafficking. I'm here today representing the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, where it is my privilege to serve as both the U.S. Interdiction Coordinator and the Director of the National High Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas Program. As the U.S. Interdiction Coordinator, I advise the ONDCP Director as we create policy and coordinate activities to reduce the flow of illicit drugs across our borders and into our communities. Through its coordination function, the USIC ensures a comprehensive and cogent approach to securing the nation's borders, supporting the President's executive orders on ensuring the territorial integrity of the United States and addressing the national emergency at the southern and northern borders. To make this direction efficient and effective, I draft the applicable portions of the National Drug Control Strategy, the National Interdiction Command and Control Plan, and border interdiction strategies for the southern, northern, and Caribbean borders of the United States. The centerpiece of my team's work is the HITDA program, which provides federal grant funds to areas determined to be critical drug trafficking regions of the United States. HITDA allocates nearly $300 million in federal funding to support the strategies developed and implemented by coalitions of federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial partners. I deeply appreciate Congress's strong bipartisan support of the HITDA program and want to personally thank you for your support for the HITDA program. This support is critical because as we speak, America is facing the deadliest drug threat in its history. Over the past 25 years, the number of fatal overdoses involving synthetic drugs, including fentanyl, have increased nearly 100 times. And the illicit drug threat continues to transform. We must dismantle the supply chains for illicit drugs and their raw materials and attack the global criminal networks fueling these American deaths. This includes the drug cartels that have inundated the United States with deadly drugs, violent criminals, and vicious gangs. Our federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial partners work tirelessly to interdict illicit drugs, weapons, and proceeds, and to dismantle criminal networks wherever they reside. I look forward to telling you more about the outstanding work of these tireless patriots. As a result of the recent executive order designating cartels and other organizations as foreign terrorist organizations and specially designated global terrorists, we expect to see additional authorities for law enforcement to investigate and dismantle these networks and place new pressure and threat of prosecution on entities that support and enable the cartels. Law enforcement working to disrupt drug trafficking networks need access to telecommunications, automated license plate readers, financial transactions, and illicit firearms data. Developing and deploying these technologies is critical to investigative success. It's equally important these tools are used to maximize investigative efficacy while minimizing any risks to the privacy of innocent Americans. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today and to share the perspective from the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Protecting Americans from illicit drugs and the traffickers who harm them is our mission. Our strong interagency partners, as represented by my fellow panelists from the Coast Guard and Customs and Border Protection today, are key to disrupting and dismantling criminal networking organizations. Collectively, our work is leading to real progress under President Trump's leadership, and with your support, I'm confident we will continue to stop traffickers and save lives. I'm happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly. Admiral Chamie, you're recognized for your opening statement.
Good afternoon, Senator Budd and distinguished members of the committee. I request that my written testimony be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your continued support of the United States Coast Guard and the young men and women who selflessly volunteer to serve our nation. Throughout our 234-year career, our workforce has always been our greatest strength, and I am incredibly proud to serve alongside them. I very much appreciate the title of this hearing, A View from the Front Lines. It's a good reminder for me of why I'm here today, to share with you the successes and challenges of our crews who do the mission every day. Throughout my time in uniform, the best part of my job has always been bragging about my crews. And now sitting before you, I'm honored to share just two of their success stories over the past month. On February 2nd, Coast Guard cutter Joseph Doyle and a Coast Guard aircraft were patrolling south of the U.S. Virgin Islands. The cutter stopped and boarded a go-fast vessel, seizing 2,000 pounds of cocaine and detaining 3 Venezuelan smugglers. Thanks to the crew of that cutter and aircraft, they kept over $16 million of drugs off American streets. On January 23rd, the crew of Coast Guard cutter Weishi was patrolling far off the coast of Mexico when the crew spotted a go-fast vessel with 3 outboard engines. The Coast Guard helicopter employed their precision marksmen to shoot the outboards, and the boarding team seized 6 tons of cocaine valued at almost $100 million, and they detained 10 smugglers from Mexico and Ecuador. In all of fiscal year 2024, the Coast Guard interdicted 106 tons of cocaine with a street value of $3.2 billion and detained 213 smugglers. That sounds good, but I would call it an average year. This year, our crews have interdicted 108 tons of cocaine, and they have already surpassed last year's total only 5 months into the fiscal year. This pace, however, is not sustainable. For every drug interdiction, each crew has countless stories of engine casualties, electronics failures, and just last week, one cutter discovered a hole in the side of the ship with seawater pouring in. making our crews' lives even tougher when they order the parts to make repairs. Sometimes we don't have them on the shelf or they're not even available. And sometimes we take the parts off a ship returning to port so another ship can go out to sea. Our crews know we're the world's best Coast Guard, but we need to do a better job to make them feel that way. I've talked a lot about cocaine because bulk cocaine is smuggled at sea. The interdiction of cocaine matters because the same cartels who smuggle cocaine produce and smuggle fentanyl. When we interdict the smugglers at sea, we work with our interagency partners in the intelligence community to determine who these criminals are, which cartels employ them, and how and where these cartels operate. Cocaine is the cash crop for transnational criminal organizations, the cartels. Their huge profits from cocaine fund other nefarious activities like human smuggling, weapons trafficking, and production of synthetic drugs like fentanyl. Fentanyl is the leading cause of drug-related deaths in our country, but cocaine still kills upwards of 25,000 Americans every year. Although we rarely encounter fentanyl at sea, the Coast Guard is actively finding new ways to get after this problem. We are working alongside federal, state, local, tribal, and international partners to protect the American people and ensure our national security remains strong. The Coast Guard does a lot of things, but we don't do it alone. Whether in the field, in a skiff, or in a courtroom, we count on each other every day to achieve mission success. We proudly serve alongside the Department of Defense, our many homeland components like Customs and Border Protection and Homeland Security investigations, and with the Department of State and Department of Justice, just to name a few. On behalf of our acting commandant and our entire workforce, active duty, reserve, civilian, and auxiliary, thank you for your enduring support of the United States Coast Guard. I look forward to your questions.
And Mr. Miller, you are recognized.
Senator Blackburn, Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Cantwell, and distinguished members of the committee, it is an honor to appear before you today on behalf of the men and women of Air Marine Operations to discuss our critical role in interdicting illicit drugs in the U.S. territorial waters and maritime approaches as part of U.S. Customs and Border Protection's comprehensive approach to border security. While AMO has existed in its current form for less than 20 years, its origins trace back to the legacy U.S. Customs Service, and we continue to meet a longstanding need for specialized air and maritime border security capabilities. Our operators are sworn federal law enforcement agents with a broad range of authorities to conduct counter-narcotic operations across land, air, and sea domains. Maritime domain presents unique national security challenges. Unlike air and land environments, coastal waters are vast, less restricted spaces. Countless vessels enter or operate in U.S. territorial waters every day, making detection of illegal activity and apprehending associated smugglers challenging. Many smuggling crafts hide in plain sight amongst legitimate traffic, while others transit remote areas far offshore, trying to elude detection altogether. Smugglers also use a variety of vessels tailored to the area and amount of contraband they are smuggling to best evade detection, including modified fishing boats, go-fast vessels, pangas, low-profile vessels, and semi-submersibles. Vessels are also much faster than they were 20 years ago, often leaving law enforcement little time to interdict them before reaching our shores. Drug smuggling activity in the maritime environment is a perpetual and dangerous threat to U.S. border security. Of the 234 pounds of drugs AMO seized in FY24, approximately 76% occurred in the maritime environment. In addition to high maritime drug interdiction rates, smuggler aggression and violence has also been on the rise. Since 2006, AMO has used disabling fire on the engines of fleeing smuggling vessels nearly 350 times, with more than half of those happening in the last 4 years. In November 2022, 3 of our Marine interdiction agents were shot, and one, Michael Maceda, was tragically killed during a vessel stop with smugglers off the coast of Puerto Rico. The threat of illicit maritime activity is persistent and dynamic, but AMO is dedicated and adaptable. We are continually refining our capabilities and adjusting our tactics to stay ahead of these ever-evolving threats. AMO deploys a fleet of what I believe to be some of the most powerful law enforcement marine interceptors in the world. Evolving to meet today's threats, we've recently repowered these vessels and made other modifications to this platform for a perfect mix of speed, agility, and agent safety. AMO also maintains a fleet of aircraft functionally designed and outfitted for maritime detection and surveillance. Our P-3s, Dash 8s, and MQ-9 UAS aircraft provide long-range, high-endurance capabilities in remote source and transit zones, while the Super King Air 350 multi-role enforcement aircraft further expands aerial surveillance, closing detection and enforcement gaps in the littorals of the United States and the Caribbean. AMO is heavily invested in a variety of tethered aerostats and tactical systems, providing ground-based radar and sensor capabilities that significantly increase our domain awareness along our littoral borders and the maritime approaches around Puerto Rico, South Texas into the Gulf, the Florida Straits, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the northern border. The scale and complexity of countering drug trafficking in the maritime environment requires partnerships and operational collaboration. In addition to the U.S. Coast Guard, AMO routinely works with federal, state, local, and foreign partners and is one of the largest contributors of flight hours to Joint Interagency Task Force South, supporting counter-narcotics operations in the vast 42 million square mile source and transit zones. With a fleet designed for rapid interdiction, airborne and ground assets that provide critical domain awareness, and agents with extensive law enforcement experience, AMO brings a unique capability to detect and disrupt smuggling operations before they reach our shores. With few exceptions, AMO's Marine Law Enforcement Authority is limited to customs waters or 12 nautical miles from the coastline of the United States. CBP continues to work with Congress on legislative changes to extend the customs waters from 12 to 24 nautical miles. This extension of law enforcement authorities would enable AMO to more effectively enforce U.S. laws at sea, expand our counter-narcotics operations, support our partners, and carry out our border security mission. Senator Blackburn, Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Cantwell, and the members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Ms. Kelly, I want to come to you with my first question. I'm looking forward to introducing a bill that would reauthorize HITDA at an increased funding level. And in Tennessee, I've heard from so many of our law enforcement personnel how important this is. I want you just to speak for about 30 seconds. What would happen if we did not have this?
Thank you so much, Senator Blackburn, for your support and for the question. I think what we have heard persistently from, in particular, our state and local partners is that the HITDA program is essential for the coordination of federal, state, local task forces. We heard from the first panel how important it is for the federal government to engage with the partners, the 18,000 sheriff's departments and police departments across the nation who otherwise, without the framework and the structure of the HITDA program, may not be equipped to share information freely, to coordinate on these cases, and to make sure that we have a holistic, whole scope of government response to dismantling the criminal networks that are trafficking fentanyl from the southwest border all the way through the interior of the United States into every state and territory across the country.
I appreciate that you all talked about our borders and what is coming in shipping containers from China and what we are seeing in our ports. But in Tennessee, we've got the Mississippi River and the port in Memphis. And what I would like to hear from you is what we can do, how your agencies are working on these inland rivers. And I know the FBI put a memo out warning of increased China influence on the Mississippi River. So, Mr. Miller, I'm going to start with you and just go down the line. I'd like to hear what you all are doing when it comes to our inland waterways.
Thank you, Senator. So AMO has Marine units in the Gulf. I would say the biggest impact in terms of our inland waterways is the support that we provide to state and local agencies in the area, to include task forces. We provide aerial surveillance with light enforcement helicopters with specific capabilities to track narcotic smugglers or any kind of trafficking that state and local agencies are working, and we provide greater officer safety during buy-bust operations or high-risk warrant operations.
Okay. Admiral?
Good afternoon, Senator. Ma'am, we work across the interagency with all our partners throughout Homeland, also state, local, federal, and tribal to get after a lot of these problems. The Coast Guard is a multi-mission service, so many of the same crew members who might be doing a search and rescue case one moment could be boarding a vessel that's coming in potentially with illegal narcotics. The ability to shift between missions is a critical capability of the Coast Guard, and that is fed by intelligence. The Coast Guard is a member of the intelligence community, and we work across the IC to help put our cutters and crews in places where we know the worst problems will be so that we can effectively respond.
Ms. Kelly?
I appreciate that my co-panelists have both mentioned information sharing. HITDA, as you know, is a key framework for sharing information from our federal partners down through our state and locals, who in many instances are the ones actually enforcing the drug laws, particularly in some of our more rural and remote areas.
Rear Admiral, I'd like to come to you on this. I think it is helpful that President Trump has identified the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. And so as we look at dealing with these cartels, is there any further authority that the Coast Guard needs in order to apprehend and to work in this process with the IC?
Good afternoon, Senator. I'm very appreciative that the president has designated these cartels as terrorist organization. I think that sends a message that we as a government are deadly serious and are bringing all of our assets and resources to bear to get after this problem. I'd be happy to answer the question for the record with a list of additional authorities that we might be able to use to get after that.
That would be very helpful. That's the kind of information we need. My time's expired. Senator Cantwell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the second group of panel witnesses who have been on the front lines of fighting this. Very much appreciate your being here today. I wanted to start with you, Director Kelly, just in comments about the legislation that we introduced last year. You were supportive of that, which I appreciate. But this whole area of how to build capacity at attacking the transportation networks. We heard from Spokane Chief Hall about why this worked and why it does work, right, in the sense of the transportation networks beyond the border. What do you think? You think that you can easily grow that capacity within your organization, is that right? The support for our legislation, which requires a Stop Fentanyl Smuggling Transportation Network strategy.
Thank you so much for the question, Ranking Member Cantwell. And we share your keen interest in ensuring that all modalities of our transportation network are secure. That has been a particular challenge in the past, and we have focused increasing efforts on ensuring that we're hitting all points through our partners at the U.S. Postal Inspection Service and securing our parcel systems, also attacking transportation on rail via air, both passenger and cargo. We share your interest as well in a fentanyl strategy. Certainly at the Office of National Drug Control Policy, biannually we prepare the National Drug Control Strategy, and our next one will be due in 2026. But we certainly appreciate the focus that a fentanyl strategy would bring, and we are happy to engage with our partners at the National Security Council and lead that effort.
But once we had that in your authority, you could plug this into the current system and then just leverage this extra local law enforcement effort to go after these transportation networks.
I think we would have to build out a complete plan for this, but certainly that using the existing framework would make great sense.
Great. I just wanted to clarify that because I feel like you were already somewhat there, but this is about growing the capacity to target these transportation modes. And did you want to comment anything about the technology, the vapor, how important a breakthrough that could be?
Absolutely. I think we are very interested in ensuring that we're using bleeding edge technology when and where possible. I would also mention, though, that we want to make sure that we maintain robust support for all dimensions of interdiction, which would include ensuring that we have manpower who are trained appropriately, who are good, well-equipped at detecting suspicious behavior when they pull someone over as part of a roadside interdiction, making sure that we're also funding canines. This is a much more basic foundational effort, but in some places we're still hearing from state and local agencies that they don't have resources like that. So I think we do want to hit it on all fronts with both the high-tech solutions, but also the more nuts and bolts solutions as well.
Yeah, you're not going to find a bigger supporter of the canines than myself. Talking to CTAC, they were like, people walk in, they see the canines, and they turn around and leave. It is a deterrent in and of itself. But the non-evasive technology issue is just a way to say to the bus stations, to the airports, to everybody, we're going to catch you, and hopefully, help us in that effort. I wanted to ask Mr. Miller about CBP's use of safe boats, their organization in our state, but apparently that structure works well.
Thank you, Ranking Member Cantwell. Yeah, absolutely. The safe boats that we have, and I've visited where they make them for us in Bremerton multiple times. So we have two varieties. We have a center console version that we refer to as our coastal interceptor vessel. It's 40 feet. It's custom designed specifically for our needs. And then we have a closed cabin version called the all-weather interceptor that we use in more of our cold weather locations. Both of them have been game changers in our fleet. We used to, legacy customs, we used go-fast vessels that we basically turned into law enforcement vessels, but these are the first ones that are custom tailored for law enforcement.
But these are helping us on our waterways detect the smuggling on
Absolutely, absolutely. We've recently repowered them. We're doing other modifications to make them safer for our agents during high-risk pursuits and boardings.
Thank you, and I'll have something for the record for Rear Admiral to talk about but very much support the Coast Guard in increasing capacity for them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Cantwell. Admiral, you mentioned in your testimony that the Coast Guard is using small unmanned aircraft as part of the combined force package for drug interdiction. Could you tell me what sort of unmanned vehicles the Coast Guard is deploying in its drug interdiction mission? And are there any other UAS platforms that the Coast Guard is looking to deploy but not currently using?
Good afternoon, Senator. So I don't use the term game changer a lot, but when we started employing the Scan Eagle unmanned aircraft on the national security cutters, it did change the game for us. The way that we pursue drug smugglers on the high seas is with a package of a cutter with a helicopter that can shoot out the engines, and then a maritime patrol aircraft that's overhead to find them and then cue the cutter to get after that with its small boat. When you have an unmanned aircraft and you can launch that from the flight deck of the cutter and put that up there, then you don't have to rely on scarce long-ranged aircraft from either CBP or Coast Guard or other agencies. So it is indeed a game changer.
Is that fuel or is that electric or what type of propulsion?
Sir, I'd have to get to the actual specs on it.
Right. Continuing with you, Admiral, the Aviation Logistics Center at Elizabeth City, North Carolina, my home state, is the central hub of the Coast Guard's aviation program. In addition to conducting heavy maintenance on the existing fleet, the ALC is also instrumental in the fleet's transition to both the C-130J and the MH-60. As the Coast Guard expands its drug and alien migrant interdiction missions, are there additional needs in the Coast Guard aviation fleet or at the ALC specifically that this committee should be thinking of?
Yes, Senator, and thank you for your support of the Aviation Logistics Center, the work that they're doing there to missionize new aircraft and then to do the depot maintenance on our 60 aircraft to get them up and flying for longer as part of their service life extension program is absolutely critical to the organization. Sir, the bigger answer is we need more aircraft. We are constrained by the resources that we have, both the fixed wing like the C-130Js, and moving forward, we're going to need to figure out a way to get more rotary aircraft to deploy on both our cutters to get after drug smugglers and also for shore-based missions. We need to raise our top line. Sir, we've been saying for a while now that we're a $20 billion Coast Guard on a $12 billion budget, and those sort of top line increases will help us get after aviation and everything else that we need.
Thank you very much. Mr. Miller, your testimony mentions a November 2022 incident in which 3 air and marine operations marine interdiction agents were shot, 1 tragically being killed. You also reported that AMO enforcement resulted in the seizure of more than 1,500 weapons in fiscal year 2024. Does your office have any record as to how often AMO agents are subjected to incoming fire while carrying out their missions?
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, the event in 2022 when Mike was killed was tragic and a game changer for air and marine operations. We have seen an increase in violence and non-compliant boardings, and we have changed our training significantly. We've outfitted. I mentioned we have outfitted our vessels differently with different safety equipment and armament. We've also equipped our agents differently as well. So I think you'll see the most capable air and marine agents to date.
Thank you very much. Continue on, Mr. Kelly. Your testimony mentions your work with the Interdiction Committee to continue drug interdiction efforts across the federal government. The DOD has several members on the Interdiction Committee, but do you think more direct engagement from the DOD along the southern border would be helpful in stopping the flow of illegal immigration and illicit drugs, particularly now that President Trump has designated many of the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations?
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, we work very closely with DOD right now, NORTHCOM, JTF North, and we are coordinating with them currently on any kind of additional force laydown that may come to the southwest border, and we welcome any assistance in that effort.
Thank you very much. Senator Kim, you're recognized.
Thank you. I appreciate all of you coming on out and talking with us. Director Kelly, I think I'd like to start with you. You know, I think all of us here recognize we want to have a comprehensive approach to this. You know, that includes some of these efforts go after the cartels, on immigration, but there was also a statistic that I come across, and I guess I just wanted to ask you if this was correct. I saw a statistic that came across saying that U.S. citizens made up 80% of individuals with fentanyl seized at ports of entry, and I wanted to just ask you, does that sound correct to you, roughly?
I would certainly defer to our partners at DHS, which would be the source of that statistic, but yes, it sounds generally correct.
I guess I wanted to ask, and to whatever extent, Mr. Miller, you want to jump in as well, but do we have an understanding of who these Americans are, in terms of affiliation with, criminal operations or other things of that nature? Mr. Miller, I want to just check with you if you have thoughts here.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. So I would definitely say that the cartels are running all the narcotics operations on the southwest border, and then they'll utilize anyone that they
so
can exploit.
they're recruiting Americans to help this get across the border. Is that what you believe is happening?
I have no doubt of that, Senator.
Okay, I'm just thinking through this in terms of just what are the different ways we can sort of disrupt this operation and kind of engage and understand how that recruitment might be occurring, other types of ways in which we can engage. Director Kelly, you talked about the leading edge tech that is component of that, and you also mentioned a number of other aspects that are important when it comes to interdiction. But on the leading edge tech, I guess I wanted to just ask you, as I'm trying to explain to the people in New Jersey what way we should be putting our priorities. I've certainly heard a lot about scanning technologies, but what are the other types of technology that is proven to be best practices, and where are we at in terms of scaling that to the level that we would need?
Thank you so much, Senator Kim, for the question. I think we have two dimensions that we have to consider in responding to that. Part of it is developing the technology and the other part is making sure that it can be deployed to all of the partners that we need. We recognize that we are relying in large part here on the work of our 18,000 sheriff's office and police departments across the country. And so for them, this bleeding edge tech, even if we have it, it may never be within reach. So we have to be thinking about what makes sense in terms of broad scale investment, and then how much of that can be actually in the hands of state and local officers. So on the first point, I think I would defer to our experts here from the actual border, from CBP, who I know leads a lot of the technological development for the southwest border and also for the maritime space. What I think we might want to be thinking about when we're talking about state and local deployment, though, may be sort of second generation technology, where we're thinking about handheld scanners. We're thinking about ensuring that they are trained so that they can properly question drivers in roadside stops, so that they're not taking the personal risk, if you're thinking about state patrol officers, about pulling over a tractor trailer with a hidden compartment and thinking about delaying the schedule of commerce in the United States. So I think it's a broad range depending on whether you're talking about the federal investment directly or whether we're talking about something that's deployable to state and locals. And
I appreciated earlier that you also just raised the importance of just ensuring that we have enough canine investment as well. So, I think so often here in Congress, we get caught up on just the tech, but remembering that it's the manpower as well as, some of these other types of tools. Mr. Miller, I just wanted to turn it over to you if you have anything further here. Just help us understand, where should we be when it comes to this leading edge tech, and where do you think we're at right now? I want to just understand your understanding of the Delta.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. As Assistant Director mentioned, at the ports of entry, technology is vital for sure. I would say in between the ports of entry, I think any kind of technology that assists in domain awareness is critical, whether that's our use of radars, aerostats, cameras, our use of artificial intelligence or machine learning. Another critical gap that CBP has that we're working through and trying to catch up with is the counter UAS threat. So, there's that is a threat along the border that's a threat to our agents, whether it's surveillance of our operations from the south side of the border, flying contraband in small loads across the border. We've seen what the cartels do to each other using small drones, dropping explosives, and then, of course, with AMO, collision of risk with aircraft. So, legacy customs radars along the border were historically meant to detect general aviation aircraft and ultralights, and not meter or less size targets operating extremely low or slow. So we're catching up with that technology, deploying tools that can detect and mitigate this new emerging threat.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Kim. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Senator Budd. Ms. Kelly, I think a key step in addressing the illicit drug threat is ensuring the existing programs within the government are working. As you know, the High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas Program, known as HITDA, is a cornerstone of how we combat regional drug trafficking throughout the United States. And I have seen firsthand in my state of Nebraska, especially for law enforcement in rural areas with fewer local resources, how important this is. For example, HITDA is the primary resource for the Wing Task Force that covers 11 of our panhandle counties. Through HITDA, the task force has developed a uniquely cooperative investigative program which is helping Western Nebraska law enforcement more actively manage narcotic and criminal investigations. In your view, how would you evaluate HITDA's effectiveness nationwide?
Thank you so much, Senator Fisher, for your support and for the question. Nationwide, we're extremely proud of the work that HITDAs are doing. One of the things that we often tout is that for every dollar invested in the HITDA program, the rate of return is $63, which is a pretty phenomenal testament to the success of the program overall. In 2023, HITDA's collectively disrupted or dismantled more than 3,000 drug trafficking organizations or money laundering organizations, and collectively they seized more than 2,000 metric tons of drugs, which I think also completes the narrative here. Often when we're talking about drug interdiction, we have a tendency to focus on the ports of entry and at the borders, which is critical to our overall success. But we often like to point to the work of the HITDAs interdicting drugs within the interior of the United States. And I think the success rate there is phenomenal as well.
What challenges do you see or that you possibly anticipate in the future in meeting your goals that you have out there?
Thank you, Senator, for asking that question. We do face myriad challenges. In some communities, the focus on drug trafficking is often subordinate to other threats, which is certainly a challenge in terms of making sure that there are state and local resources to put on HITDA task forces. I would also say fatigue is a huge element for us, and I think it's why the focus on border security and interdiction at the ports of entry and at the borders is key, because I think we're asking an awful lot of our state and local task force officers when they are being asked to interdict drugs that did evade the borders, and when they're being asked to investigate the types of networks that are directly linked to cartels. That's a huge challenge. It's a training challenge, and it's a resource challenge for all of our task forces.
You know, you brought up the border, and obviously that southern border is a major disruption zone. In years past, we've struggled with all the different agencies out there using different intel, using different maps, whether it's DEA or FBI or CBP or the Department of Defense as well. I think we have to have a shared map, government-wide shared map to identify the threats that we have. In your testimony, you noted efforts by the Drug Enforcement Administration to map out this data comprehensively. Can you speak about that further, please?
Thank you so much for that question, Senator Fisher. I agree. I think we all agree that a common operating picture is imperative. And a big challenge for us, too, is making sure that we are in a place where we can share information freely from the IC all the way down to our state and local partners. This is where we really rely on the work of our federal agencies to be the bridge so that, as you say, the map, the common operating picture can be not just conceived, but then communicated from top to bottom.
And how do we achieve that?
How we achieve that is a work in progress. It is, I won't lie, it's a challenge. It's a challenge both in terms of the security levels, but it's also a challenge in terms of culture and promoting information sharing. We're talking about people who are accustomed to building trust with each other as people to share information, and sometimes when we're working cross-community like that, we have to figure out not just one bridge, but multiple ways to bridge that gap.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Senator Budd.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator Lujan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Fentanyl is devastating communities across the country, and stopping it at the border is critical. Advanced technology is one of our strongest tools in this fight. Most fentanyl enters the United States through land ports of entry, which is why I've advocated for getting 100% screening using non-intrusive inspection technology, NII. Now, NII has helped CDP intercept massive amounts of fentanyl in cargo and vehicles, over 200,000 pounds in the last 3 years. While I know it's outside the jurisdiction of this committee, we need to further invest in these technologies to save lives, strengthen border security, and ensure law enforcement has the tools they need to fight the fentanyl crisis. Now, Mr. Miller, your testimony states that the Air and Maritime Operations, AMO, has integrated artificial intelligence into its systems to help detect illicit activity, but that cartels appear to still be exploiting gaps in our enforcement capabilities to evade detection and find ways to move fentanyl through our waters. AI has the potential to revolutionize interdiction by identifying smuggling patterns and improving real-time threat detection. What is AMO doing to fully leverage AI and next-generation technology to stop traffickers before drugs reach our communities?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Yeah, so AI has changed the game. When you're, for example, if you're some of our radars, when they're tracking targets in the maritime approaches, some of the areas that are more remote, just a mere presence in an area is suspicious. Other areas such as the Florida Straits, especially approaches going into Miami or Fort Lauderdale, where you have such a high concentration of recreational vessels, you need to have something else to assist in filtering nefarious from recreational. And that's where we use AI, machine learning, building algorithms that can identify patterns to point out or at least lessen the clutter of the sheer volumes of targets on the radar.
And what partnerships exist between CBP and entities like DEA, FBI, and DOD to enhance intelligence sharing and leverage advanced detection to technologies already deployed?
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, like Assistant Director Kelly mentioned, I don't think we've ever had a better common operational picture with the partners, with the capabilities that we have. We have our Air Marine Operations Center, for example, in Riverside, California, that can ingest all of the radar feeds, or individual camera feeds, or even pictures that agents are taking on their cameras, and then share that with a community where you literally have a single pane of glass of partners working together.
Just last year, the commander for the U.S. Northern Command told another Senate committee that as many as 1,000 unmanned drones cross the U.S. southern border every month. As I mentioned earlier, DEA data also indicates that most shipments of fentanyl come across the border through land ports of entry. Yes or no, is the threat coming from the air and our land ports of entry?
Thank you, Senator. As was mentioned earlier, we really don't know because we're catching such a small percentage. I will tell you that the vast majority of seizures are coming through the land ports. We have not seen fentanyl being smuggled in drone crossings along the border, but that certainly doesn't mean that it isn't happening.
Do you know what percentage of vehicles, passenger vehicles, are screened that enter the United States through the southern border?
Senator, I do not. I would defer to my partners with Office of Field Operations.
I appreciate that. I can submit that a little bit later. I know that it's not 100%, and I don't even think it's 50%. Back in 2008, 2009, it was like 5% or something, some ridiculously small number. So if 90% of the fentanyl that the U.S. is interdicting at the southern border is being done in passenger vehicles entering the United States, and we still randomly look at cars and we're still screening a very small percentage of them. Again, 100% screening of inbound and outbound passenger vehicles, and I would argue cargo, and I would point to the water ports as well, that there's much more we could be doing with modernizing water ports of entry. I'm reminded of a report that came out from the Department of Homeland Security, I believe under both President Trump's first term and President Biden's term as well, that suggested that there were precursor chemicals that were being intercepted, stolen, after they would get on land, off the ship, on land, and then they would be taken to the screening facility. Between the water port and the screening facility, they were getting stolen. And then they were being driven to Mexico. And they were coming back to the United States as fentanyl. How in the world is that happening? 100% screening, stopping what's happening in these cargo containers, I believe will make a big difference. Now, I have several other questions. My time's already run out here. I'll submit them into the record. I appreciate this important hearing, and I certainly hope that there's some ways that we can get some of this adopted into good policy and get it funded, and make sure you have the tools you need. Thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you, and thank you all of you for your work. I've been going back and forth between agriculture and judiciary, but I wanted to be here at least for the tail end of this because we've had a lot of issues with fentanyl in our state. I've worked a lot on the social media side of it with a number of other senators to try to cut down on that. As we know, a lot of kids especially are purchasing pills that way, but we also need to stop these illicit drugs and fake pills from entering our borders in the first place. I thank you for your work. Director Kelly, your written testimony referenced the government's efforts to combat fentanyl trafficking through the mail, including the 3,800 pounds of fentanyl seized by the Postal Inspection Service. I lead bipartisan legislation known as the STOP Act 2.0, which builds on the original STOP Act that Senator Portman and I did that was enacted by President Trump in 2018. Can I count on ONDCP's support as we work to build on legislation to crack down on fentanyl through the mail?
Senator Klobuchar, thank you so much for the question. We absolutely agree that stopping the flow of fentanyl through the U.S. mail is key, and we rely heavily on our partners from the U.S. Postal Inspection Service to do that work. And we would also add that fentanyl flow through express consignment carriers, private industry partners like UPS, FedEx, and DHL is equally key.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Also, I just want to note, I know that Senator Blackburn asked you about the HITDA program, and it's very important in our state to our counter-narcotics efforts, so I appreciate that. I used to be a prosecutor and get this coordination, how important it is, so I wanted to add to that. Rear Admiral, I know that the Coast Guard plays a major role here, and we love the Coast Guard in Minnesota. We especially love icebreakers up on Lake Superior, but could you talk about what you would need in terms of Coast Guard cutters to bring down the cocaine that we're getting in?
Good afternoon, Senator. Yes, ma'am. In short, we need more of them. We are currently building new offshore patrol cutters. We're finishing up the program for the fast response cutters. We're still running our older ships. 10 years ago, I was a commanding officer of a cutter that was almost 50 years old then, and we are still operating it today. We have trouble getting parts for those ships, and when we have a scheduled maintenance period like a dry dock, we don't even have the funding to be able to take that ship and make sure it can continue to operate. I mentioned in my opener, we had a ship with a hole in the side of it with water rushing in last week, and that ship was built in the 80s. So we're running these old ships.
Like when Cabbage Patch dolls and Walkman were popular way
Yes,
back
ma'am,
then?
I remember that. And yes, ma'am, those are the ships that we're using, and we need new ships and new aircraft to replace those so we can get after today's threats.
Okay, thank you. Could you talk about how working cooperatively with our allies strengthens American law enforcement and national security interests? I just always think, I'm not going to go out to some of the issues we're having right now with our allies, but I think people don't realize sometimes the law enforcement coordination that goes on. Could you?
Yes, Senator, I think people probably don't realize that right now we have a Dutch ship patrolling in the Caribbean with a U.S. Coast Guard law enforcement detachment on board, and just in the last 2 weeks, they've had 2 drug interdictions of cocaine. And we are able to prosecute those cases because we had a U.S. law enforcement detachment make that interdiction. So the U.S. attorney will take the case, we can hold those people accountable, but more importantly, we can get the intelligence from that case, use that to feed the intel cycle, and then figure out how to dismantle the cartels because of it.
Okay, very good. I'm going to end a little early in deference to my colleagues. So thank you.
Senator Rosen, you're recognized.
Well, thank you, Chair Butt, and thank you, Senator Klobuchar, for giving me a little bit more of your time. Anyway, thank you to our witnesses for being here today. It's a really important hearing. And I want to talk about the impact of the current administration's actions on your ability to do your job. So, Ms. Kelly, I don't need to tell you or any other members of this committee how vital the work that you do at HIDTA, or I'm going to just say what we usually call it, HITDA, how important that program is. In Nevada, we have 2 high-intensity drug trafficking areas, and according to the Southern Nevada Health District, between 2020 and 2023, the number of fentanyl overdoses among residents of Clark County, our state's largest county, increased by 97%. That's why programs like HITDA are needed now more than ever, and I've strongly supported their annual appropriation. Unfortunately, according to several reports and lawsuits filed by state attorneys generals, both the OMB hiring freeze and the subsequent pausing and reallocation of resources have impacted funding for the HITDA program. So Ms. Kelly, can you talk about how these actions have impacted the work that you do, your ability to stop the drugs from coming? Are you currently receiving the necessary support and funding to carry out your crucial work?
Thank you, Senator Rosen, for the question and especially for your support for the HITDA program. We deeply appreciate it. Happily for us, the funding freeze that our grant program was subject to was fairly short-lived. It was rescinded within about 4 hours. So we were in a position that we had to pause, but it was a very brief pause, and we're happy that the HITDAs are back and running as usual.
Thank you. I'm going to move on. I know Senator Klobuchar talked a little bit about international cooperation. Of course, Minnesota on the Canadian border there, but I want to talk about Southcom, because I sit on Armed Services Committee, and in our hearing with Southcom Commander Richardson, the general spoke about our armed forces' success in detecting and seizing maritime drug shipments, including the importance of working with partner nations to increase our drug seizures. So, excuse me, so Admiral Chamie, how can we work together and leverage our international partners, not just with Canada, but to improve the detection of precursor chemicals, and allowing us to shift our interdiction efforts earlier in the fentanyl production process? How can we best equip the Coast Guard to do that?
Good afternoon, Senator. So with Southcom, they have a component command in Florida and Key West called the Joint Interagency Task Force South, and it performs the DoD's detection and monitoring function. Basically helps get the intel and tells Coast Guard and other allied partners where we should be patrolling and where we can focus. Under the Indo-Pacific region, the Indo-PACOM has a component for the Joint Interagency Task Force West. They do similar functions over there to focus on the larger ships that might be bringing fentanyl precursors into the United States. And in fact, just not too long ago, they worked and had an interdiction of a commercial vessel bringing precursors, fentanyl precursors, into Mexico, and they were able to work with Mexico to seize those precursors when they entered port. Those type of international relationships and working with both components for Indo-PACOM and Southcom are critical to us.
Thank you. I appreciate your work there. When the last minute or so I have left, I want to talk a little bit about our borders and the non-intrusive scanners that we can use. Because last year, during a hearing on DHS FY25 budget, it was mentioned how critical it was for funding to be included for the installation of the new non-intrusive scanner technologies, like the low-energy portal LEP scanning systems that stop the flow of fentanyl into the United States through land ports of entries, which is, of course, I think some of the most common ways that fentanyl are smuggled across the border into our country. It was also discussed at the time that a number of high-tech scanners that have been provided to CBP officers to identify and stop fentanyl were sitting unused in warehouses. So, Mr. Miller, are similar scanners being used at maritime ports of entry? If so, are they operational? If not, is there a way for us to adapt this technology and use every tool in the toolbox to stop these deadly drugs from coming in? And to tell us what you might need. Please.
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, I would defer that to the experts that use that technology in Customs and Border Protection, the Office of Field Operations. Well, I will tell you that is that non-intrusive inspection technology is part of the multi-layered enforcement strategy at our borders and to include our ports. The X-ray, gamma ray, and other kind of sensing technologies is invaluable in discovering smuggled items. They also have mobile systems as well that they will bring along to some of the NSSEs that we participate and provide security with as well, Super Bowls, events in the NCR, et cetera.
Thank you. I think it's really important that we use all of these. And then I would just want to add that when we do think about adding these new technologies, we need to add improved Wi-Fi, different kinds of space, make sure that all the surrounding infrastructure is there for these capabilities. So thank you for allowing me to go over my time, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. And again, I thank each of you all as part of the panel today. You know, Mr. Miller, in our dialogue earlier, we use acronyms like AMO and incidents, and You referred to Mike having lost his life. So again, we're thankful for him, for his service, and we're thankful to his family as well. This is dangerous business you all are in, and we're grateful for each and every one of you. Senators will have until close of business on Wednesday, March 5th to submit questions for the record. The witnesses will have until the end of the day on Wednesday, March 19th to respond to those questions. This concludes today's hearing. The committee stands adjourned.